Photography was practiced in a number of different ways in relation to art in this period. So a lot of the photographers, including Rylander, were colleagues of painters, and there was a movement in painting in England at this time called the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Pre-Raphaelites were an English group of painters that strongly identified with intellectual life. They had literary themes and historical associations in their paintings that often prominently featured religious and moral themes. Not entirely unlike what you saw in the two ways of life, okay, but in painting rather than in photography. Then the Pre-Raphaelites used photography as reference material, and they influenced the popular use of this medium for art purposes. Here's a painting that is typical of the kinds of things that the Pre-Raphaelite painters made. Now, this painting is called Ophelia, and it evokes the narrative of Hamlet. Ophelia was the young woman from Hamlet who committed suicide in a very dramatic and emotional fashion because of Hamlet's ignoring of her. So this is Ophelia. Culturally, it's a deeper story because she's sort of saying something to the people of her time, Victorian high society, about the young women that surrounded them and the way that young women felt trapped by their very limited role in society. So there's a whole world of cultural conflict that's under the surface of this character of Ophelia. But the Pre-Raphaelite painters, they take these literary themes as subject material for their paintings. Now, it so happens that Jean Millet would have been very wise to have used a photograph for reference for this painting. Other painters of his time did. He personally did not, and Elizabeth Siddall, who posed for this painting, actually spent time, hours and hours, day after day, in a tub of water, posing for him so that he could get a very naturalistic rendition of the way that she looked floating in water. She got very sick after that painting session, and she never really completely fully recovered. She lived for a number of years later, but it's said that she never fully regained her health after that time. So photography would have been really good for him to use as a reference in this case, and he in particular didn't do it. There were other photographers at this time who imitated this style that people had an appetite for in painting, but they did it in photography. This is Henry Peach Robinson, who we also saw his image fading away a little bit back, and you can see his composition of the Lady of Shalott here. It has a lot in common with that image of Ophelia. Here's a painting by Dante Gabriel Rossetti of a model named Jane Morris. You can see that it's very natural looking to us. It looks very lifelike and very elegant and very beautiful. This is a painting that he used photography as source material for. So these are some of the photographs that Rossetti used as source material for his paintings of Jane Morris. These photographs are useful for an artist because they can sit still forever, where a person may not be able to sit still forever, and they can capture a sort of fleeting facial expression that can be difficult for a person to hold. And of course, the photographs are useful for us because as people who lived much, much later, we're able to see what Jane Morris looked like in real life. And if you compare the way that Jane Morris looked in the photograph to the way that Rossetti painted her, you can see that his interpretation, his subjective, imaginative skills as an artist really make her look quite different in a painting than she looked to the sort of clinical eye of the camera. Julia Margaret Cameron was a photographer that we'll pay a little bit of extra attention to because she made photographs not as reference material for artists, but as artworks in themselves. She was very familiar with the Pre-Raphaelite painters and very connected in that world. She spent a lot of time in England, where a lot where she lived, but also spent time in India, where her family owned a plantation. She took up photography as an adult at the age of 48. She was mostly self-taught as a photographer, and she has a unique visual style that is characterized by a lot of blurs and smudges and overexposure. We'll look at some examples of that, but this is an approach that she integrated as an artistic style as opposed to just like making mistakes. Well, her social circle included very important figures in history, including Sir John Herschel and many giants of literature, art, science, and government. Alfred Lord Tennyson, the noted poet, was a neighbor of hers, and Cameron created a tremendous series of photographs that were commissioned by him to illustrate an edition of his poetry epic, Idylls of the King. Here's one of Julia Margaret Cameron's portraits of Sir John Herschel. Herschel is an important figure in the history of photography because he was the inventor of this chemical stop bath that was necessary to keep a negative from continuing to be subject to the impressions of light. That stop bath is what made photographs permanent. So he was an important chemist in the development of photography. Well, he was also part of Julia Margaret Cameron's social circle. She knew a lot of people who were in the Royal Society, and she photographed him. He was ambivalent about this portrait because, for one thing, because he's an older man in the photograph, he wasn't too crazy about the way that his lines and things on his face looked. He was also ambivalent about the softness of the picture and whether that was the best use of the photographic medium. He preferred for the detail to be sharp. This portrait of Thomas Carlyle is typical of Julia Margaret Cameron's approach to portraiture. So she gets very close to the subject. She's framing very close to the face. There's not a lot of attention to clothing or to pose or to setting. It's really just very close to the face, and nothing's really going on in the background. You'll also notice that the focus is not very sharp. That you can see some detail on the clothing, the tie and the clothing that's directly underneath it, but the detail of the face is a little bit blurred. Here's a close-up where you can see that blurring a little bit more clearly. So this blur is due to movement on the part of the subject. She's photographing in very rudimentary conditions where the exposure time is very long, and her subjects, the subjects of her portraits, would often write in their journals and in their letters about what an ordeal it was to sit for her because the exposure times were so long. So these kinds of blurs are very common in her pictures. So this is a portrait of one of her nieces, Julia, who features in many of her photographs. Julia Margaret Cameron had this photographic style that incorporated soft focus, as you saw previously, sometimes blurs from movement, sometimes because the depth of field was so shallow with the photograph. You can see that her way of processing the negative is a little bit uneven, that it's a little bit lighter around the edges. In her time, a lot of those edges would often have been covered by the mat that went under the frame, in the way these would have been shown by people who owned them. So that part's not uncommon. But there would be smudges, and there would be fingerprints, and there would be sort of like peeling emulsion, or it was peeling off of the glass plate. Um, all over her photographs. But for Cameron, this was important. For her, this is not a problem. This is something that she embraced and did lots of, because for Julia Margaret Cameron, those were marks of the human hand. And those qualities that showed that this had been made by a person and not by a machine were the distinguishing features of photography as art. So this is something that's intentionally posed, composed, and planned so that it will affect a person who looks at it in a way that's like a painting affects a person, not as a sort of mechanical record of the way that a person looked at one point in time, but as something that is a creation of the imagination using photography as a tool. So her approach to photography and portraiture in this way was not universally accepted. There was some controversy around it. Some people immediately resonated with this sense of emotional expressiveness and the beauty and elegance of her photographs. Others kind of dismissed it as being too casual, and the fact that she was a woman had a lot to do with that. Nonetheless, her style of portraiture was made an impact, and her photographs, because they were of well-known people, were widely distributed and became very famous in her lifetime. On the left-hand side, you see Julia, her niece Julia, who became a prominent member of literary society, ultimately became the mother of Virginia Woolf. And this photograph of Virginia Woolf, which became pretty famous in years that followed, you can see that it bears some sort of structural similarities to Julia Margaret Cameron's style of portraiture. A lot of Cameron's photographs illustrate literary themes and ideas and characters from literature. Like this is from a popular story from her time about little children who had survived a shipwreck. Some of Cameron's photographs depicted figures from the Bible or from mythology. Now, Cameron was friends and neighbors with Alfred Lord Tennyson. This is a portrait that she made of him, but she sort of snidely captions it "the dirty monk" to make him look like he's a figure from the Renaissance, maybe. This is one of the photographs that went with the ideals of the king, and that's ideals with a Y, meaning that it's poetry that describes the life of the king. So this is a long epic poem of in this part story of Sir Lancelot and Queen Guinevere. Other literary themes that she approached included the works of Shakespeare. This is a photograph where she's actually posed her husband as King Lear and other figures from society around her as the daughters of King Lear. One of the young women who was part of Julia Margaret Cameron's social circle and who posed repeatedly for her was one Alice Liddell, who you see here. She was also in the previous photograph as one of King Lear's daughters. When Alice Liddell was a young girl, she was photographed by Charles Dodson, also known as Lewis Carroll. He was himself an amateur photographer, and he's well known for his works Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, which were distinctly inspired by this Alice Liddell when she was a young girl.